Welcome to the Creation Innovation Podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth King. Together, we'll have conversations with incredible human beings who have taken their creative outlet and turned it into something innovative. From people leaving the corporate world to be 8-figure entrepreneurs to people who have created books, created a family, or just creating to have fun in the world. We are all in a journey to create something amazing in our lives, and I hope that you find some inspiration of your own here. This is the Creation Innovation Podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to Creation Innovation. Today we have Kate Carson. Thank you for being here, Kate.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
She's a somatic love, sex, and relationship coach who specializes in life after baby loss. She lost her own daughter, Laurel, in the late stages of pregnancy after a diagnosis of brain anomalies. She has been a space holder for grief and an activist for women's rights ever since. So, thank you for being here. I know this is such an important topic. And interestingly, I feel more common than people realize. And unfortunately, in the worlds that you and I run in, more common. But for most people, I think kind of, I don't want to say take it for granted, but in a lot of ways, go through pregnancy and everything really oblivious to how significant things become during that time. So thank you for holding that space for people in these moments. So can you give us a little bit of your story and what pregnancy was like for you prior to Laurel? I don't know if you have your children were before her or after her, but give us a little background on that if you don't mind.
Oh, absolutely. So I have a daughter who came before Laurel, and I have a daughter who came after Laurel. So with my first pregnancy, it actually was like a pretty good pregnancy. So I'm really glad that I have that experience because after that, things really headed south for me. But
Right.
I, my husband and I wanted to have a lot of kids. We had planned that pregnancy. It took about 5 months to get pregnant my first time, and I remember being worried, like, oh, you spend so much of your life trying not to get pregnant. And then as soon as you try to get pregnant, I expected it to happen immediately. And when it didn't, I was really
Right.
worried. But that's still well within the range of normal.
Yeah, and
Um,
5 months at that time feels like a lot. For
right.
people that are listening, you feel like, okay, 1 month, maybe 2 months, what's starting to go wrong? 3 months, something must be wrong. But really it is normal.
Yeah, exactly. And I can know that now, but at the time I was
Sure.
pretty bent out of shape about it, understandably, because if you want something so badly and then it's just not happening, it starts to feel very out of control.
Right.
Um, so that pregnancy was a healthy pregnancy. My daughter Elsie came like 41 weeks, which is very typical for a first baby. She was born in a hospital. I wanted to have a, quote unquote natural delivery. But I made it like 19 hours and then I was just exhausted. And I accepted an epidural at that point and slept the last 6 hours of labor. Um, and
I had
yeah,
3 C-sections, and I do not know how women do natural childbirth just without any medication. Even
it,
prior to my it's you guys are all my heroes to even attempt to do that, so
well, you're my hero too, because it is a lot to have a birth by surgery as
that
well.
is
That is a
true. There's
lot.
no easy way, but yes.
Yes. So, and there was a complication after that birth. So there was
Okay.
several hours after I had a bleeding emergency, which was, so my baby was healthy, everything was great, it was very joyful, and then all of a sudden it turned very scary, all of a
Mhm.
sudden. And they gave me a really terrible intervention that I'm sure saved my life, but was not any fun to experience. And then a few days later, I was sent home with a baby, and it's a big transition to go to motherhood, even when your baby is healthy, even when despite that bleeding emergency, it had been overall a pretty healthy birth. So that
What
was my
was
experience.
the bleeding emergency?
Well, it was retained products, so it was a little bit of placenta had been left in me,
Okay.
and because of the long labor, the protracted labor, the my uterus didn't totally go back to size, didn't totally contract down, and the blood vessels did not totally stop bleeding. And I didn't know because it was sort of building up inside of me, and then when I got up to brush my teeth, it all came out of me all at once, and it was really quite alarming. It was really quite alarming.
And the reason I
Yeah.
ask that is for people who are listening that may not have gone down the road yet of having a baby, that not only do you deliver the baby, but then you also deliver the placenta. And sometimes people don't understand that that could have some complications with bleeding and whatnot. And so again, I always go back to it is as much as it happens million times a day around the world, it is quite an experience to be cautious of,
Yeah.
and be aware that it's good to know your body. It's good to have people around you that can be aware of what's happening. I'll use my sister as an example. She had a home birth, and um, if my mom wasn't there, she would have died because the midwives were like, "No, she's okay, she's okay." And my mom could tell that she was quickly losing blood and she was hemorrhaging
Oh,
from
no.
the placenta, and
Yeah.
she was in ICU for many weeks, and her whole endocrine system's shut down and whatnot. So it is a very sensitive situation, and I just say that for people because I know births are very successful in a lot of ways, but it's also something to be very sensitive about because there are things that can happen with our bodies. So, okay, so you ended up
Yeah.
going home with healthy Elsie and everything was good after that.
Yeah, she was a very easy baby. I was, of course, in over my head because it was all brand new, but she
Right.
was a very easy baby. And in
Good.
retrospect, I'm really glad. Um, when I had some trouble breastfeeding, but I did resolve that with the help of a lactation consultant and a support group. I really can't say enough about support groups in general when you're having a hard time. The community element is really important.
Mhm.
So after that, when we tried to get pregnant again, I actually had 3 miscarriages in a row. So
Okay.
my first pregnancy after Elsie, it lasted to about 13 weeks. I guess we found out a little before that that it was a blighted ovum, and a blighted ovum is when there's a placenta, but no baby ever develops. So you're pregnant. You got all the hormones. I was very sick with morning sickness. However, I I had no baby and it was not a viable pregnancy. And I just thought like, well, I want to miscarry. I'll just wait till I miscarry. But I waited for a month and did not miscarry.
Okay.
And at that point it starts to get dangerous, like for infection reasons. And
Did you
I
take
ended up
any medication to help the process, or you just thought it'll happen naturally?
well, I was offered medication and it's so funny because everything was new to me and I really twisted myself into not worrying about it. If I had to do it again, I would absolutely take the medication up front
Uh-huh.
because I I regret waiting that long. It was every single day thinking I would miscarry and then not. It had a huge impact on my life. And then in the end, too, it puts you at a greater risk for infection if you carry and carry and carry an unviable pregnancy. So I didn't take the meds. By the time I called up, I was like desperate to get that pregnancy out of me. Immediately, I went in for the DNC, and I had a DNC in a hospital under general anesthesia. And I was sad, like, I was definitely sad, but the DNC itself was sort of no big deal. Like, it didn't I had to take it easy for about 3 days after. It was not nearly as, like, hard as I thought it was gonna be.
Right. And also, I would imagine having that month of anticipation of this happening at home gave you some time to process in a
Totally.
sense versus those of us that may have had a loss where it's like we're at the doctor, they tell us there's no heartbeat, we get a
Yeah.
DNC 2 days later type of thing, right? So we don't have as much time to really grasp what has happened, why this happened, and whatever. So I, certainly, I think it's always traumatic to be going through any of those situations for sure. But also, I do, in my own experience, have noticed that time does have a healing effect on the
Yes.
situation in whatever way that may look like as well.
Yes. Yeah, it does. Time does have a healing effect, and in that one, I was surprised by how much I grieved,
Hmm.
but it took me a few months, and then I felt like my normal self again.
Hmm.
Um,
And I think that grieving though, Kate, is though I always say this, we as soon as we have that positive pregnancy test, we have the idea in our head, okay, what is Elsie and
yes.
this baby going to look like in the back of my car? What kind of stroller are we going to get? What's our family going to look like now? So it's grieving also the idea of the family that you were missing. So that's why I tell people it doesn't matter if you're 13 weeks, 2 days since you saw your pregnancy test or whatever, you already have that story written in your head, and so you're grieving that process.
Absolutely. And you're not just, as you say, you're not just grieving what you're losing, in this case, just a placenta, right? I was grieving everything I had imagined, all the hopes and dreams, everything that I was building up in my future about it. And I really did want kids close in age, right? So that gap gets wider and wider with every loss. So
Right,
my second miscarriage happened spontaneously at home. And in a way, it wasn't as fraught as the first one, but in a way, it was more fraught because that gap kept getting wider. And
right.
then my next miscarriage was even earlier. So, in a way, again, I was like hardened to it. And in a way, it was even harder because that gap was even wider. So,
And I don't know
yeah.
about you, but for me, I felt like, okay, my first time miscarriage, check the box of the statistic, right? One in
Hmm.
4 have a miscarriage. Okay, good. Got that out of the way, I guess, right? And then it
Yeah.
happened again, and I was like, no way. What is happening here? Then that's really, so the first time was really difficult emotionally. Second time was even more difficult in a sense because I thought, how could this possibly be happening again? That's really when I started to internalize a lot of it, of thinking there's definitely going to be something wrong with me.
Yes, absolutely. That whole feeling of like, oh, I can't build a healthy baby,
Right.
even though that's not true. It's not true that it's our fault, right?
Correct.
Babies build
Correct.
themselves from the pieces we provide, but it starts to really get into my identity. It starts to really get into, I don't know, and my association with pregnancy is suddenly very, very fraught as
For
well.
sure. Absolutely. And that's where we talk about all the time the trauma of pregnancy after loss. No
Right.
matter what degree it is, you still you're robbed of that joy of thinking,
Yes.
okay, we're so excited. We got the 2 lines today or whatever, right? And then it goes on to this happy exciting time. It becomes a very stressful, knuckle clenching time until you get to whatever point that is. And for some people,
Yes.
it's not until the baby is in your arms and outside of your womb to say, "Okay, I feel okay." And even still then there's residual trauma, I think, for people of thinking, "What if something happens to this child?" etcetera. So that's a whole nother podcast. But okay, so you had your third, and then what
Yes.
happens?
And then I got pregnant again. And as you said, like I've got the buildup now of worries about how it's going to go. And so I went into that pregnancy so worried that I was going to have another miscarriage. And I think partly because of that, I accepted the label of anxious pregnant woman,
Mm,
right? Because I was anxious. I really was. Um, but
rightfully
so,
so. That was your
right?
experience.
Hmm. But as the pregnancy wears on, I started to have actual, like, concrete worries about this pregnancy in particular. So,
Okay.
but at every step of the way, they would tell me, it's okay. She looks great. She looks great. She's healthy. She looks great. But as I get into my second trimester, my third trimester, something about her movement was wrong. It just felt wrong as compared to Elsie's movement. So Elsie,
Okay.
for instance, would do responsive kicking at a certain point. Like I would sort of pat her and she would kick back.
Oh,
That
okay.
never happened with this baby. That never happened with Laurel. Elsie would sometimes take a nap and not move for a little while. That never happened with this baby. She moved all of the time, and the movements were really, really spastic. And so I would tell my doctors, I'm really worried she never stops moving. And they'd say, that's so great. Her kick count's so high. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Like she never stops moving, even for an hour, like never stops moving.
And this was even after your anatomy scan and
Hmm.
everything there, okay.
Yeah, at my anatomy scan, I had been leveled up for another one, for another look, and at the MFM, at the like more fancy
Yeah.
advanced anatomy
Maternal
scan,
fetal medical doctor.
hmm,
Mhm.
exactly. They were like, "No, this baby's super healthy. She looks great. Congratulations." And I said, "Should I come back again just to be sure?" And they were like, "Absolutely not. Have a nice life."
Wow.
Right? Unfortunately, they were wrong. They were wrong. And the only reason I found out they were wrong is this time I was planning a birth center birth. And my midwife was not happy with my attitude basically. And she said, you know, if you want to do this, like, we really need to get you so you're not terrified. So let's go send you for another ultrasound. And so she sent me for another ultrasound. We thought it was going to be a peace of mind ultrasound, that I would come home feeling confident and ready for a birth. And when I was 35 weeks pregnant by the time I got in for that ultrasound, and what they found was that my baby's brain had not developed properly. She had, among other things, a seizure disorder, which I think is why I was feeling what I
Oh,
was feeling in terms of her movements. But
mm,
she had Dandy Walker malformation and agenesis of the corpus callosum. Now, we couldn't get in for an MRI for 2 days, but when we did, her prognosis was really poor. She was not supposed to be able to walk or talk or support the weight of her own head or swallow. Those were just some of the things.
so you did a fetal MRI at 35 weeks, is that what you're saying? And that's how you were getting this diagnosis?
So the first part of the diagnosis came with an ultrasound at 35 weeks,
Uh-huh.
and they would not give us a prognosis. So they would not like tell us how it would affect our baby until we had the MRI and talked to the neonatal neurologist in particular.
Okay.
And that happened 2 days later. So 35 weeks plus
Okay.
two, you know.
Okay.
Um, and that's when we really got, no, I guess that was 35 weeks even. Sorry, MRI on 35 weeks even. So that was when we got the prognosis, which was very, very, very poor. And he, not only was it a significant disability, which is what he's telling me, right? But I said, if my baby can't do any of those things, does she just sleep all the time? And he actually winced and he said, babies like your baby are not often comfortable enough to sleep.
Mm.
So my husband and I, this is what we were left to process. And I remember saying, like, well, okay, so she can't swallow. So I guess we know how she's going to die. We would like to refuse interventions. We would like to refuse the feeding tube. And they said, oh, you can't refuse a feeding tube.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I had sort of taken for granted that palliative care would be available for a baby as sick as my baby, but it was not.
Wow.
They wouldn't call her condition lethal, even though they told us many, many ways in which it would kill her. So it was definitely going to kill her, but it was not lethal, according to their lexicon. It's not
Is
the way
this
most of us
do
understand it.
I'm curious, do you know if this is just a Massachusetts state
So
situation or
the word lethal is tied to prenatal and perinatal and like early natal care in many states. It's tied to when and where you're allowed to get an abortion. It's tied to when and where you're allowed to access hospice care. So I don't know state by state what the law is, but I know that this was the law in Massachusetts in 2012 when I was going through this. So we were told that our choices were either threefold. We could have this baby by C-section early, straight to the NICU. We were definitely not going to be breastfeeding. Like, she was going to be a NICU baby. I called my friend who was a NICU nurse who said she'd seen 3 babies like this in her time and none of them had ever gone home. So she may never have gone home. And
Mhm.
then the second thing we could do is that we could find an adoptive family to care for her once she was earthside.
Wow.
And I was like, people adopt children like my baby? And they said, yes, some people do. There is a special service available. So they gave me that number. And the third thing we could do, and they said right away, like, we don't know if this is available, but we'll look into it, is abortion. And we chose abortion, and we ended up finding a doctor in Colorado. So I had to fly with my husband from Massachusetts to Colorado. We found out her prognosis on a Friday, and we booked the appointment on the Friday. We had to be there on Monday, show up on Tuesday with $25,000, and then stay for the week for this procedure. It was an outpatient procedure that was 4 days long.
Wow, I am so sorry that you had to experience this, first of all. It sounds like a nightmare in
Yeah.
all ways, and I would imagine that, as I said earlier, time healing, I haven't been through this, but I feel that time probably doesn't heal in this way, uh, in in the way that other things do, I guess. And I say that in the most loving way, in the fact that I feel like that trauma and all the memories of that probably continue to come up in such a powerful way for you. And thank you for sharing the
Yeah.
story because I imagine that it is something that is not easy to continue to talk about, but I know that it does help so many people who are also going through that. That's actually how I
Yes.
became a bereavement doula because I was seeing some of my clients and patients that were having late term terminations because of the same types of situations where they had terminally ill children that
Yes.
just wasn't an option for them to carry to term for one reason or another, or just the choice that like you were given. And I know that those memories stay with you.
Yes. And there are ways in which time definitely has helped, right?
Of
12
course.
years later, I'm certainly not in the same place I
Of
was
course.
1 year, 2 year, 3 years out.
Mhm.
But I I still she's still my daughter. I still miss her. And the ways in which my loss was compounded by bad law,
Mhm.
right, has added more trauma to than I think I would have had if I had
For
gotten to stay
sure.
home. And there's trauma anyway, right? There's going to be trauma anyway when you lose a baby, especially in when you have to choose to lose a baby. It's so confusing,
Right,
right?
right,
Um, but the bad law really made it worse to the point where there are still a few lingering places of my PTSD. Like I've done so much work. I've had great practitioners. I've really integrated very deeply, but if I go for a blood draw, my body still freaks out.
mhm.
So my next round, I'm just starting brain spotting this week, actually,
Oh,
um, to do a round of brain spotting on getting basic medical care so that I don't have to have these flashbacks every time I go back into a hospital or anywhere that smells like antiseptic.
right, interesting. I think that also the situations in our country this last year probably would be very triggering with all the laws changing and things that have come up around fertility and abortion rights and all of that.
Yes. Yeah, it used to be very, very rare to be like me and have to travel. It is not rare anymore. I see women traveling all across the country, Maryland, DC, still Colorado. There are a few places that will take them. And I see many, many more women having to travel than before. And their spouses as well. It's it's really hard and the clinics are slightly overloaded and it's a really tough situation. So yes, politics definitely is its own set of triggers. Election years are particularly bad. And I am an activist. One of the ways that I am an activist is that I help mentor new storytellers to get our stories out to the general population because these are very private and difficult and taboo
Right.
stories.
And what I've seen with my clients is when they do seek that kind of community help, support during those types of losses, they find that really triggering because somebody who may lose a baby at 35 weeks naturally versus someone who had
Yeah.
to make the choice to terminate at a late term carries its own set of situations as well. And so I just make that point to say there's no judgment and no right or wrong of how you're feeling. No matter how you're feeling, it's the right way to feel. It's just get the support that you feel good and aligned with. So whether that is a support group or whether the support group is triggering for you, find somebody who can help you through it because it is something that definitely needs to be addressed in order to live a happy life and be present for your other children that are here and your family and yourself most importantly.
Yes, absolutely. Getting the support that is just right for where you are and when you are is really important. And I hold a space at Ending a Wanted Pregnancy, a 2000, it's 3,000 people now. And we see people come in and out of that group all the time because sometimes it's the right thing to just be immersed in these stories and sometimes it's not,
Right,
right? Sometimes you need to shelter from them, like when you get pregnant again. And
right,
it's okay. Like whatever people need at any given time is welcome. Um, and I also started giving one-on-one support and couple support for the cases where you really don't want anyone else in the room.
right,
Um, and that also is very valuable. But grief steps on other grief's toes, and there's almost a necessary stage of comparison to make sense of what happened to you. And when that happens, it can be very difficult to be in diverse grief space. And if that's true, that's fine. You just either find a more specific one or you find a practitioner to hold you one on one, and it's all good.
yeah, and again I'll say so necessary as much as you feel that you can power through it on your own or it will pass. It really is important to find somebody that can hold your hand through that period of time. Just again, for your own well-being so that you can heal properly. Your heart has to take time to heal, and there's your body physically. I know most
Yes.
people come to me because they want to get pregnant right away after. There's some people, even though they know they're going to be stepping into this PTSD because of it. They want the baby. They want another baby, and so they want to figure out how they can go on to have their next one. So, speaking of your next one, how long after Laurel were you able to get pregnant with a healthy pregnancy after?
So I had talked to my doctor in Colorado, Dr. Hearn, and he had said, I think you need 6 months to a year to be physically and emotionally healed enough to have another pregnancy. He's a very gruff doctor, like he said it very matter of factly, but I appreciate that. That really landed on me in crisis, like the
Mhm.
straightforwardness of his discourse. So I said, okay, we'll put it on the calendar for 6 months. We'll try again. But I got to 6 months, and I understand the clients who come to you and they really want to get pregnant again because I have that reflexive need to get pregnant again, right? It's like the body just like craves to be full of a baby again. But after a few months, it subsides and it didn't feel as like much of a need anymore. And what I started to notice was the trauma piece. And so I got to 6 months and I felt like I wasn't ready to try again. So
Right.
we went month by month. And at 9 months, I felt like I was ready to try again. And we got pregnant on the first try. We had a physically very healthy pregnancy, emotionally fraught with PTSD.
I'm sure.
So
And what
in that,
support were you
yes.
getting during that time, during that pregnancy?
So I got a lot of extra ultrasounds. You better believe I had a maternal fetal medicine specialist giving me lots of extra ultrasounds up through 25 weeks because the brain's the last thing to develop. So they should be able to see these problems by 25 weeks. And that was the legal cutoff at the time in Massachusetts. We have since changed it. So if you're in Massachusetts,
Good.
please don't let your hospital tell you old news. You can
Yeah.
get this procedure here now. But I I, at the point of 25 weeks, he offered me to either graduate to low risk care or to continue, and I chose to graduate to low risk care. At the same time, I also switched from my general therapist, who was so nice, such a nice lady, really wasn't helping me at all,
Mhm.
to a trauma specialist who was sort of seeing me through my pregnancy week to week.
Right.
And with his help, I was able to sort of tease out what was PTSD and what was my true desire for this pregnancy. And you're going to think I'm crazy, but I ended up choosing to have a home birth for this baby. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of them being that my new worst case scenario was that my baby shouldn't live but would be forced to live, which
Mhm.
it may or may not be rational, but given my own lived experience, it did make
Course.
sense.
Of course.
Um, and so but I did not feel okay choosing to have a home birth until I had done some real trauma integration because as I've already spoken about, I know that when I go, that I'm afraid of hospitals now. Ever
Mhm.
since the diagnosis, that happened around the diagnosis, I like freak out in hospitals. Um, that's relevant when you're having a baby. Like you don't want to freak out when you're having a baby, but also you don't want to be so afraid of a hospital that you don't go when you need to go promptly.
Right.
So I hired a very experienced midwife and I told her, you're only going to have to tell me one time to go to if we're going to, just going to say, we're going to the van, like get in the
Right.
car.
Right.
And that's going to be it. And we will go. And that's why I'm hiring you to have like a really keen eye for anything being out of the ordinary.
Right. Well, congratulations on your last baby to be
Yes.
here and a
Thank
healthy
you.
birth experience as well. I'm glad that that worked out. So,
Yes.
and how can people find you and work with you?
So my website is nightbloomcoaching.com, NIGHTBLOOMCOACHING.com. And there I have a blog if you want to read about my work. I specialize in relationship to your own body, just learning to trust and love your own body and even feel like you're living inside of your own body again. And also relationship to sexuality, taking the triggers out of your pelvis and relationships, because stress on a life is stress on a marriage, and there's really not much more stressful than pregnancy loss or infertility journeys. So please find me there, read the blog, reach out if you would like my direct support.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I just want to add to that again, through my certification in the bereavement doula situation, it wasn't a surprise to know that relationships have strain. But what was surprising is the violence that comes with the grief around a loss of a baby at any stage, whether it's a stillborn or late loss, early loss. And so, if that is happening to you, please notify your local police station about domestic violence or that you're afraid of something, because a lot of times couples don't know how to deal with the grief, and sometimes that turns to violence. And we don't often hear about it because people don't talk about it in correlation to pregnancy loss. But I just want to mention it here because it was very eye opening to me when I started to help in this realm, and how common it is to have the conflict between the partners involved, because both are just so traumatized and in such deep grief, they don't know how to communicate with each other in a constructive way. So getting the help from someone like Kate to work through those things is really important and vital to your relationship as well. So
Yes.
thank you again for sharing your experience with us and such a deep personal story. I'm so grateful for that, and I know that it will help so many people, and all that you do with holding the space for everyone else now.
Well, thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Creation Innovation Podcast. Make sure to follow us on Spotify for free episodes and subscribe to the Creation Innovation Podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you choose to get your podcast. Don't forget to rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening for a chance to receive a special gift. Yes, we actually do send out gifts. It's my favorite thing to do. So visit us at elizabethking.com/creation innovation for more information on how to enter. Every review counts, and we are so grateful. You can follow me at the official Elizabeth King on Instagram or TikTok. Until next time.